Welcome to Imagine Otherwise, the podcast about the people and projects bridging art, activism, and academia to build better worlds. Episodes offer in-depth interviews with creators who use culture for social justice and explore the nitty-gritty work of imagining otherwise. I'm your host, Cathy Hannabach. This is episode 102, and my guest today is Amy Lam. Amy is a writer and editor based in Portland, Oregon. She's a contributing editor and co-host of the Backtalk podcast at Bitch Media, as well as the editorial assistant at Diacritics. She's also the former editorial lead at On She Goes, which explored the world of women of color and travel. Amy is a Kundiman Fellow and received an MFA from the University of Mississippi, where she was the John and Renee Grisham Fellow. Her work has appeared and is forthcoming in Tin House, Gay Mag, Pacifica Literary Review, Utna Reader, and Paper Cutter. Amy is a former punk kid who penned a long-running column in the nonprofit music magazine Razor Cake. In our interview, Amy and I chat about the power of feminist podcasting, how histories of race and colonialism shape the ways that different women of color approach leisure travel, how to write travel stories that ditch the old cis white guy tropes for more political and accessible forms, and why drawing inspiration from her childhood dreams of a more just future is key to how Amy imagines otherwise. Thanks so much for being with us today, Amy.
It's my pleasure. I'm so excited to talk to you about everything.
So many of our listeners might know you as the co-host of Backtalk, one of Bitch Media's really amazing podcasts. What got you interested in podcasting as a genre?
I think mostly because I'm such a big fan of podcasts. I've just been listening to them since, I guess iTunes had the option for it. I started listening to podcasts when I was living abroad. I was living in Bangladesh for a while, working, living there, and one of the ways that I connected with what was happening back at home was through listening to This American Life. This is back when the options for podcasts were really limited because not that many people were making them, and so I just understood that there's a way to listen to essentially radio shows on demand, and it's just such a fun format and a great way to connect with listeners and to talk about bigger issues. And I also really love the format where it's a chatty podcast. I love produced podcasts where there's a lot of production value behind them and they're telling a narrative story. But I also really love chatty podcasts where there's two hosts talking. And so that's one of the reasons why I really love doing Backtalk, especially with Dahlia Balcazar, my co-host, where we get to hash out current events and pop culture news with each other. And it's engaging. I hope for listeners, but mostly in a selfish way for me, because then I get to analyze and synthesize ideas sort of in real time and to break down things and to help myself understand bigger issues better.
I'm really curious about the co-hosting relationship, because this is something that has come up on a couple of episodes of this show where I've talked with folks who co-host podcasts. Some of them co-host them with friends or colleagues, some of them with partners, which brings a whole other dimension to it. How do you and Dahlia kind of work out putting together the actual podcast? Are there certain things that one or both of you are responsible for, or is it just we need stuff to happen, somebody volunteer?
I'm so glad you brought up podcasts that are hosted by couples, because I literally cannot imagine. That seems like a big landmine. But for me and Dahlia, I think it really helps that we're friends and we're able to communicate and share ideas and pitch to each other what we want to talk about. But I did want to take this time to say that when we started podcast, it was between myself and my first co-host, Sarah Merck, who used to also be with Bitch Media. She used to be the online editor. And so with Sarah, her and I, we worked out the way we shared responsibilities. And so it just kind of carried over with Dahlia. And the way we do it is that it's a show that comes up twice a month and we pitch ideas to each other about what we want to talk about. And then we kind of one or the other kind of volunteer to lead that segment. And then we just kind of figure out what each other like points we might want to talk about. I mean, I think a big secret for even chatty podcasts is that often we have like a doc we're working off of, where we have written notes for ourselves. And so we share that doc where we have notes about like maybe what points we're sure we want to speak on. And I think maybe perhaps one of the ways it works really well is just that we just talk to each other a lot off of the podcast, where we try to figure out, who does what. And then we work with our producer. We've had some amazing producers in the past, and we're also working with a great one now. And so we just have to like keep lines of communication open from like before we record, during recording, and then post recording, because then we have to do edits to the track. So it's just, I guess with any other working relationship where you want to be successful, we just communicate a lot. Maybe we over communicate. Maybe that's like a podcasting thing where we just talk too much to each other. But I think it's worked really well. And we've been able to talk about things that both have interest, both of us, and like fire us up as we're speaking on it. And it's just been really fun. And I think that's probably another big part of it, is that we just really enjoy it, and we enjoy each other's perspectives, and we enjoy what each other has to say about something.
Do you have favorite episodes?
Oh, yes, I definitely do. Actually, we just did one, and it's about Facebook and how Mark Zuckerberg was just testifying in front of Congress. And it was a really fun episode, which sounds weird to say because we talk about how horrible Facebook is and the impact it has had culturally, and sort of the responsibility that Mark Zuckerberg has had taken part in it, and to always remember the origins of Facebook and how it was a website that was invented and put together to rate other classmates based on their appearance. So it was a really fun episode for me because I love it when Dolly and I are both able to like do research on this topic and then come together and like present our research to each other and kind of also crack each other up and surprise one another with what we found out. So that was one I really enjoyed doing. And then maybe a couple months before that, we had a back to school episode where we talk about federal policies having to do with how we educate kids in school, in public school, and what types of policies shape our educations, and in fact how our education sort of then go on to inform our worldview. It's kind of cheesy, but like there are episodes where I'll listen back and then I'll text Dolly afterwards and be like, I think we did a good job on this one. So that's like my metric for what's like an episode I really enjoy. And to sound even cheesier perhaps, on my website at byamylam.com, I have like a podcast tab, and I do list some of my favorite episodes on there. And those are ones where I feel like all of our ideas come together in a way that just works out really well, and we're able to sort of like communicate what we really want to say. Because another thing, to be frank, is that sometimes there are episodes where I feel like maybe we could have expressed our ideas in a more clear way, or there's more ideas that we wanted to get in. But sometimes when it just comes together so right, I do actually enjoy it and think we did a good job.
So can we shift a little to your journalism, your writing? Because I think it's really interesting to hear how people talk about the collaborative work versus the solo work that they do. And you're such a fantastic example of this, right? So you do these collaborative projects like the podcast, but you also write. And so as a journalist, as a writer, a lot of your work, well, you cover a billion topics, but one of the kind of main themes that made me particularly curious was travel, and the kind of the way that history and colonialism and race and gender and all of these kinds of things shape the way that you approach travel, and then the way that you write about travel. So what, first of all, got you interested in writing about travel?
So much. I think it was at first influenced by my time when I was living abroad. So I lived in the countryside, like rural China for a year. And then I also lived in Bangladesh, like I was mentioning, in Chittagong for a year and a half. And at that time, I really did rely on travel writing to understand places that I was going. And I wanted to understand, what lens people were writing through, and how, in a way, my experience differed than what I was reading about. So I think that sort of planted the seed for me, especially as somebody who grew up being raised to be fearful of traveling, if that makes sense. So my parents are both refugees, and so when I was, being raised in the States, they were just very protective. And I get where they were coming from because, they had to move to a whole new country where they didn't speak the language to raise a family. So they just wanted to make sure that we were safe at all times. So I was like very discouraged from sort of stepping out of our bubble that my parents created for us so that they could watch over us. And I remember when I moved to China, that was like a big deal. My parents were very, very not supportive. But what could they do? I was an adult and I made that decision. And I remember the first time that I traveled alone in China, and it was not something I had planned on doing. It was just at the job I had vacation, and nobody else I knew had vacation that time. So I was like, well, I guess I'm just going to go to Shanghai all by myself. At that time, I definitely did not speak Chinese Mandarin very well. Even after I had been there for a year, my Mandarin was still very rusty. But I think that experience of like making it, having ridden, I think I rode the train for like 20 something hours, something I forget, 12 hours. And then having gone to Shanghai by myself and like it was a good trip and there were no huge calamities, and understanding that like I was able to move in this way, and understanding that like I was perceived differently than the way travel writers talk about their experiences, made me think about like, wow, how come I haven't heard a perspective like mine in like the wider travel writing culture. So I think that kind of planted the seed for me. And then for a while, I was the editor for On She Goes. So On She Goes used to be a platform for exploring the world of women of color and travel. And when we think about travel writing, we inherently think about like the mainstream ways of travel writing and travel culture. And often I think the mainstream ways of travel writing, it frames the visitor as being, somebody to be catered to. Like, how do you go there and sort of like take as many quote unquote experiences as possible? And, I'm just curious to how like maybe we could push back on that. And so I think that's why like the intersection of like race, gender, and colonialism and travel culture has not been like historically explored, because often the people who have been doing the travel writing are like setting the tones and boundaries of travel culture, and those are people who often have like the means and resources to travel and to pay to be paid to like think and write about it. But now that like travel is more accessible, I think we're getting new voices that are talking about what it means to move around the world and how to travel responsibly, how to be a good visitor, and like what is our impact as travelers, versus only thinking about how like the travel experience will impact us. So I think it's just part of my growth as like a person, to just think more, to be more empathetic about like our impact when we show up at places. And I think it's important to think about, because I think in our culture at large, travel is sort of seen as like this, inalienable right, and like it's very aspirational. It's like a flex when you do it on your Instagram. And you like to show where you've been in the world. But I do think that to be like a responsible person, a responsible traveler, we have to think a little bit more deeply about our impact when we show up in other people's homes, essentially.
Have you found that your actual traveling has shaped your approach to writing, or vice versa? Like, are there lessons of the road, so to speak, that you found that you incorporate into how you actually go about writing?
Oh, that's such a good question. I think maybe just in general, it's perhaps just to be more compassionate. I think that, when you travel and you are exposed and see how other people live, how other cultures treat certain things, or how other cultures live their day-to-day life, we understand there's a whole spectrum, and so it kind of opens your eyes to different points of view. And so I think not just in my travel writing, but in my fiction writing and my essay writing, it just makes me sit down and sort of like clear my mind and think about the subjects that I'm writing on. I try to do this in a more like three-dimensional way, like coming at it from 360 degrees, and to be more like empathetic to the subject I'm writing about, to be more compassionate about it. I think perhaps in that way, it's been in my mind. And, of course, it's just like combined with having some really great mentors and instructors along the way who have taught me to think about writing as a compassionate exercise and as an art form of like expressing empathy. Like my mentor, Cathy Hannabach, who I studied with in my MFA program, he really opened my eyes to like the power of like the essay and how we could be more honest truth tellers in our storytelling.
I saw that you're working on a novel and a collection of short stories. Do you want to give us a little bit of a glimpse of what those projects tackle?
I'm like superstitious about talking about my work. I don't know if you encounter that with other writers and artists, but I am like kind of superstitious about this. But I think that an overarching theme that I write about in my work is like exploring what it means to be part of like a diaspora, what it means to be displaced essentially and trying to find home. I think that's just something that I struggle with personally as a human being who exists in this world. And so my work often touches on that.
So I'm curious how you see your work in these realms, in your podcasting, in your novels, in your short stories, in your journalism, how you see them kind of combining your interests in academia, art, and activism. How do these three realms come together for you?
That's such an interesting question because I don't often actively think about it. It just sort of shows up in my work. And I think that it just sort of shows up in my work because this can sound cheesy, but like those are the values that I hold. And so it has to appear in my work in that way. I'm glad you asked this because I often in my fiction in particular, I think about like, wow, why do I sometimes feel like I have to shoehorn in these like sort of like activist-y ideas or like social justice ideas in this short story. Like, why can't I just write a short story about like an ant who like the bug, an ant, like going about her day, like struggling to live in on the ant farm. But even in my description of that I just came up with off the top of my head, like I could like think of like, oh, this could be a story about like class issues or or somebody struggling to exist within like a capitalistic world. I think it just comes from like a framework that we're working from, and I'm sure you encounter this when you talk to other artists, where it's like if it's like a thing where it's values based or like based on somebody's morals and how they want to express that externally, it just shows up in the work. That's my goal, and I hope that like I'm doing it some semblance of justice. But I think that like it's just sort of my responsibility as a person to create works that speak to me first and foremost. And often the work that speaks to me has that angle. And so I think that in that way, that's why I produce work that does intersect the world of, expression and art while thinking about ideas that have to do with my own values.
So this brings me to my absolute favorite question that I get to ask folks, which really gets at those threads that tie all of your projects together. And that's that version of a better world that you're working towards when you sit down to write, when you sit down to record a podcast, when you collaborate with folks, when you do all the kinds of projects that you do in the world. So I'll ask you this giant question that I also think is an important question. What kind of world do you want?
Wow, that is such a big question. When I think about this question, I think about me as a kid and what kind of world I wanted when I was a child. And I think that the world that I wanted as a kid was like, a very idealistic, sort of like utopic culture and society, where everybody's just very happy and get to do what they want. I think essentially that is sort of what a lot of us are fighting for in our work. But of course, as I've like gotten older, I've become like, more realistic. And so I think that like if I was thinking about it in a practical way, I've just become like kind of really hyper focused on what like an equitable world can look like in a nuts and bolts kind of way. I know that I'm a Virgo sun, and I understand what that means to be a Virgo, but I actually did not know that being a Virgo is an earth sign. I just learned that recently, and being what an earth sign means. And often people who are earth signs are just like very like grounded and are very practical and look at things in that way. And as I was reading the description of what an earth sign was, I was like, that is me. I want to understand how this can happen on a practical level. So when I think about what kind of world I want, I think about like how can this world be more equitable in a practical way, and what like everyday life could look like for everyone if we were treated in an equitable way in terms of like, accessing education or housing, employment or healthcare, environmental justice, and so many things. I'm just trying to envision a place where we can all live in and just be treated with respect and dignity, and for us to feel like we can all live in our own humanity and not be bothered for it, which seems like the very minimal thing to ask for. But I think for a lot of folks, that's not true. That's what I think about when I think about the world I want to live in, and the world that I hoping that perhaps my art can contribute towards. And I think that's such a good question to ask. So I really appreciate it, because I think that when we think about our work as artists, we do have to always have this question in the back of our mind, because we are creating something that we're putting out there, and in a way we are creating it to create some type of impact, and it's important to sort of grapple with like what the impact is, like what the impact we're hoping for. So thank you so much for asking that question.
I love that question. I have to say it's the entire reason I started this podcast. It is the impetus behind it. It's the foundation of it. It's really just an excuse for me to ask really smart, creative people what kind of world they want.
Thanks. I don't know if I've answered it fully, but I think it has to do with like my Virgo brain. It's like, this is what I'm hoping for. This is what I want to see. But like, I'm not a policymaker. I'm not like I'm not like an organizer. So these are things I'm hoping for, and I don't know how to practically put those things in motion except to just write stories or, write essays that just sort of explore humanity in general, and just hope that perhaps like my work can contribute in however small way.
I think it absolutely does. Well, thank you so much for being with us, Amy, and sharing all of the ways that you imagine and create otherwise.
No, thank you so much for having me.
Thanks for listening to another episode of Imagine Otherwise. Imagine Otherwise is produced by Ideas on Fire, and this episode was created by me, Cathy Hannabach. You can check out the show notes for this episode on our website at ideasonfire.net, where you can also read about our fabulous guest, as well as find links to the people and projects we discussed on the show.